Okay, everyone, we're looking good. I think we'll be able to begin. I'm not getting any more emails at the moment about people looking for the passcode, so I apologize if you were struggling with that. I am glad that we can all come together to learn about beavers. We are really fortunate to be able to bring Ben Goldfarb to you via Zoom and learn from him today. If you have not had a chance to read his book, Eager, I highly encourage it. It's a wonderful, well-written, interesting book. So I'm sure that he'll be able to tell us more about that. And Ben is actually working on a new book as well, which I'm happy to tell you just the title is Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. And it will be published by W.W. Norton and Company in September of 2023. So you should all stay tuned for that as well. If you don't know me, I know a number of you, but I am Sarah Gladue. I'm the Director of Education and Community Science with Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust. And I want to welcome you to our program. I see a few folks are still logging in, and we'll be recording this program. So if you don't get to stay tuned for the whole thing, or you have some friend who would like to see it, you're welcome to share it with folks. And it's all for a good reason. I'll just say I'm going to ask everyone to go ahead and mute themselves. It looks like everybody already thoughtfully has done so. And if you'll keep yourself muted, and we'll use the chat for any questions or comments while Ben is presenting and speaking, and then he will try to answer questions and comments at the end when we get to that part, and I will try to field those as well. So thanks everyone for muting yourself so we don't get distracting noises and so forth as we go along. If you're not familiar with Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust programs, we have a whole calendar full of them. So you're welcome to go on to our website and take a look at the calendar or the list of programs. One of the fun things that we're doing this winter, like we've done before, is our pop-up sledding parties. And those are Saturday afternoons. You're welcome to join us for campfire, marshmallows, lots of sledding, all at Belvedere Farm. And last weekend we had around 150 people, so we plowed out the larger parking lot. Now that we have snow, it's great fun. So bring grandkids or whoever you have and hit the big hill at Coastal Rivers. So with that, I'd like to welcome Ben. Thank you so much for being here, Ben, and feel free to share your screen when you're ready.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you all so much. How does that look, Sarah? Is that visible?
Beautiful.
Fantastic.
Beautiful.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Coastal Rivers for having me. I live in Colorado these days, but I've certainly spent a lot of time in Maine, and definitely envy your coastal access. That's something that's pretty hard to find here in the mountains of central Colorado. So today I'll be talking a lot about partnering with beavers. How can we collaborate with this animal to solve all kinds of ecological problems? But before we talk about partnering with beavers, I think it's important to establish a few basic facts about what beavers are. What are these animals, and why do we care about them so much? So beavers, of course, are rodents. They are North America's largest rodent. Typical adult beaver is 40 to 60 pounds. So I think they're quite a bit bigger than most people realize. And they're semi-aquatic rodents, right? They spend all of their lives pretty much in and around water. And they've got all kinds of fantastic adaptations for this unique semi-aquatic life they lead. They're not just partners, they're also really evolutionary marvels in their own right. They've got extraordinarily dense fur, some of the thickest pelts in the animal kingdom, which of course was their downfall. And we'll talk about that in a minute. They've got these wonderful webbed sort of duck-like hind feet, They're very powerful, agile swimmers. They can stay underwater for up to 15 minutes. So they're really, really fantastic in the water. They've got a second set of eyelids, transparent eyelids called nictitating membranes that act like goggles, as well as a second set of lips, this kind of fur-lined valve behind their front teeth. So they can close that valve and then chew and drag branches underwater without drowning. I think that's my favorite beaver adaptation, I think. And then what's a beaver's most recognizable feature? What makes a beaver identifiably a beaver? The tail, right? The tail is sort of this remarkable multi-purpose appendage. It's an alarm system. I'm sure many of you have heard the smack of a beaver's tail hitting the water, which they do to warn other beavers about the presence of predators. It's a rudder while they swim. It's a kickstand out on land, and it's a fat storage device. So beavers actually put on fat for the winter in their tails. They don't hibernate. So the tail is a pretty cool little organ. And then the other wonderful beaver features is their teeth, right? They have these kind of nice self-sharpening, chisel-like incisors, and their teeth, as you can see in that picture, are orange. And the reason for that is that the teeth are actually sort of structurally fortified with iron that beavers derive from their foods. They've got these really durable, powerful teeth, which helps a lot when you spend your whole life cutting down trees, right? Beavers eat the cambium of trees. That's the inner bark, the kind of the sugary layer that does the growing. They are totally herbivorous. Their preferred food trees are the poplar family, cottonwoods, birches, aspen, but they'll take just about any deciduous tree. They do tend to avoid conifers, and they eat lots of green herbaceous stuff as well, cattails, water lilies. I've seen them basically mow people's lawns for them. So they have pretty diverse diets, but they are totally herbivorous. So in addition to cutting down trees to eat that cambium, that inner bark, they also use the wood as construction material, right? And there are, two basic beaver structures that you've probably all seen. The first is the lodge, right? That's the kind of the fundamental beaver housing unit. They're not always these conspicuous island lodges. They're often kind of tucked inconspicuously up against a river or lake bank. But in there you've got kind of a nice dry elevated nesting chamber, which is typically lined with wood chips. You've got these kind of cool underwater tunnels that lead up into the lodge. And inside the lodge, you've got the beaver colony, right? That's the family unit. And that's typically 2 to as many as 8 or so beavers, the mother and father, male and female, mating pair who are typically monogamous. You've got the newborn kits, the baby beavers born in the spring. You've got the 1-year-olds and you've got the 2-year-olds. So you've got 3 kind of year classes of offspring all cohabitating in that lodge. The older siblings kind of help to raise the younger siblings. They live in these nice little nuclear families. And then, during their second year, those 2-year-old beavers will disperse out, look for their own territory, like they're heading off to Beaver College or something. And then the second beaver structure that you've all probably seen is the dam, right? So why do beavers build dams? Why go to all of the trouble of creating this wall out of sticks and rocks and mud? Well, a beaver on land is, as one biologist put it to me, a fat, slow, smelly package of meat, right? They get eaten by, any large carnivore. In Maine, it would be, certainly black bears. The coyote would take a younger beaver. Out here, we've got cougars. We'll have wolves in Colorado pretty soon here. So any large carnivore is going to eat a beaver. And by building that dam, they're essentially expanding their semi-aquatic or aquatic domain, right? Instead of having to walk overland to that good-looking aspen tree and risk getting eaten by a cougar on the way, they can swim up to it instead, fell that tree, and then float it back down to the lodge without ever leaving the safety of that pond. So by building that dam, they're really just expanding and improving their own habitat and shelter. And here's a picture of all that's left of a beaver after a wolf attack in Minnesota that I came upon. The wolves will actually eat the entire beaver, pelt, bones and all, and just leave the mandible and incisors. So anyway, it's kind of a gruesome picture, but the point is you don't want to be a beaver on land, right? You want to be in the water. That's why you build a dam and create a pond. And beaver dams come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. I should note that, right, not every beaver builds a dam. There are beavers, I'm sure, living in the Penobscot River very happily that, and they've got sufficient water depth there to be safe, right? And they just burrow into the bank and live this kind of, low-key, inconspicuous life without ever damming. They're really building dams in, these higher order streams and wetlands closer to the headwaters, right? Where they really have to build a dam to create sufficient water depth and extent to be safe. So they're living very happily in all kinds of larger water bodies that don't require damming. But where they do build dams, they're typically building, there's usually like one big primary dam and then a number of smaller secondary dams. A colony could be building as many as 12 to 15 dams at times. And these dams come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. Here's a nice little secondary dam in Montana that's probably 3 feet wide and 1 foot tall. That's a pretty insignificant structure, but they do get quite a bit bigger. Here's a pretty unbelievable dam in Minnesota that's probably 800 feet long and 15 feet high or so, and is obviously the work of many successive generations of beavers, all kind of adding their stick to the pile. And of course, these beaver dams can impound really impressive volumes of water. I think that here's a beaver pond formed by a single strategically placed beaver dam that probably covers 300 acres or so. And I often think that I'm very impressed by their hydrological savvy, right? I often feel like if you took an engineer from the Army Corps and said, okay, build a dam in a place that minimizes labor and maximizes the total impoundment, she would build that dam in the exact same place that the beavers chose, right? So here's one giant pond formed by a single beaver dam at the kind of the constriction where a stream passes through a narrow canyon. So they're really, they're storing remarkable volumes of water. The other beaver feature that I think we don't talk about enough, actually, is they're prolific canal diggers. We know that beavers are great builders, but they're also great excavators. And again, this is sort of about maximizing their own habitat, right? They dig these canals up into the forest. They can swim up those canals, cut down a tree, float it back down to the pond, all without ever leaving the water. And this is a really important way that they spread water out across the landscape and kind of allow the tendrils of that pond to extend up into the forest. So that canal digging is a really important way that they're moving water around the landscape. So you put it all together, here's kind of what it looks like, right? This is a beaver complex near my home in Colorado. This is at about 12,000 feet of elevation. So they really get way the heck up there. And you can see, the stream kind of comes meandering through this valley, this nice single thread sine wave. And then it hits all of those beaver dams and is basically captured in that valley, and is really saturating that valley at a huge scale. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of gallons of water, being stored in this little catchment by, a handful of beaver dams. And of course, that's essentially creating a reservoir, right? That's providing water to downstream uses throughout the summer and fall, and, kind of compensating for our snowpack as, the country gets hotter and drier. So this is, this function of capturing water and storing it in these valleys and saturating the land is just such an important thing that beavers do. So, beavers are building these dams and creating these ponds and wetlands for their own benefit, obviously, but in the process, they're also benefiting lots of other creatures as well, right? Beavers are what's known as a keystone species, a species that's disproportionately important in ecosystems. And it's, almost impossible to name a species of wild animal that doesn't benefit from beavers at some point in its life cycle. A few important beneficiaries I'd like to highlight are, certainly waterfowl and wading birds. This is a great blue heron rookery in a beaver pond in Wisconsin. So, name your species of aquatic bird, and they're doing great in the presence of beavers. Even songbirds, warblers, flycatchers, love eating those aquatic insects emerging off the beaver pond, and perching and nesting in those coppiced willows along the shoreline. So I'm sure most of you are birders. Where do you see birds? You see birds at a wetland, right? And that's what beavers do. obviously, you're Mainers, so you care a lot about moose, all kinds of semi-aquatic mammals, moose, muskrat, otter, mink, all fare beautifully in and around beaver complexes, as well as amphibians. See, this is the boreal toad, which is a species of toad that we have here in Colorado. That's basically a beaver pond obligate. It breeds almost exclusively in beaver ponds. And, on the East Coast, certainly you'd see wood frogs and leopard frogs and and tiger salamanders and newts and all kinds of amphibians hanging out in beaver ponds as well. Here's one really cool example of beaver habitat creation that just blew my mind. This is in Minnesota as well. So this is an old beaver pond. You can sort of see the faint dam, the line of the dam in the background there. At some point that dam breached, the beavers left the area for whatever reason, the pond drained, and the lodge got exposed. And in this case, a pack of wolves actually moved into that lodge and raised their pups in that lodge. So that's beavers creating habitat for the direct predator. I think that's pretty incredible. This is another kind of classic beaver beneficiary. This is the St. Francis satyr, a butterfly that is perhaps the rarest butterfly in North America. And the reason it's so rare is that its caterpillars feed exclusively on sedges that grow in beaver wetlands. So when we eliminated beavers from this continent, we eliminated the habitat of this butterfly. And now, scientists are restoring beavers in North Carolina, primarily to keep this butterfly species on the planet. So, again, they're just an incredible diversity of beneficiaries. And then, probably the species that's, that does the best, in the presence of beavers, or certainly kind of the focus of a lot of beaver management, are, salmonids, trout and salmon. This is a juvenile rainbow trout. The same would be true for brook trout and Atlantic salmon in Maine. If you're a juvenile salmonid, you don't want to live in the fast-flowing main stem current, right? You're just going to get blown downstream by the force of that water. You want to live in the slow side channel and the deep pool and the meanders and the eddies. And beavers, by building dams, create that kind of complex, slow water refuge habitat that's really, really productive for juvenile fish. And there are, again, a million studies across many species showing that beavers enhance fish production. Of course, the objection you sometimes hear from anglers and even some fish biologists is, wait a second, we're trying to take dams out of rivers right now, right? That's certainly experience that you guys have had in Maine. We don't want more dams in rivers. But, obviously a beaver dam is nothing like a giant human-built concrete dam, right? Fish have all kinds of ways of getting past beaver dams. They can swim around them during periods of high flow. I've seen them wriggling through the kind of woody structure of the dam. And they can jump over them. Here's, I know this is more sort of anecdote than evidence, although there are lots of studies showing this as well. But this is a stream in just outside of Seattle. Here's the beaver dam. Here's the upstream pool above the dam. And here are the two freshly excavated salmon reds or nests, right? So obviously two fish had no problem whatsoever getting past this particular beaver dam. And in fact, the evolutionary connection between beavers and fish is so deep that it inspired my favorite bumper sticker, which is that beavers taught salmon to jump. I think that gets at the connection nicely, right? Salmo salar, right, is the Atlantic salmon, the leaper. Well, why do they leap? Thanks to beavers. So, how many beavers live in North America today? We don't exactly know. The best guess is there's somewhere between 10 and 15 million beavers, which sounds like a lot, right? They're, certainly not an endangered species. They're not going to go extinct anytime soon. But, then you start to think, well, wait a second, how many beavers were in North America prior to European arrival? How many beavers did we used to have? And the numbers get pretty spectacular pretty quickly. We don't really know, but the best estimate is that there were as many as 400 million beavers in North America before European arrival. Those beavers would have created 150 to 250 million beaver ponds, which would have impounded something like 230,000 square miles of land underwater, which for reference is about the size of Arizona and Nevada put together. That was all just land that was underwater thanks to beavers at one point. And that historic influence on the landscape created really deep connections with Native people in North America. I think that this notion that beavers are useful and important is something that that Western science has kind of rediscovered recently, but has certainly been known by indigenous people in North America for many thousands of years. There were tribes like the Blackfeet in Montana actually had cultural prohibitions against killing beavers and refused to take part in the fur trade because they recognized that, hey, these animals create these wonderful watering holes that attract moose and deer and other game species that are important to us. So beavers were actually sanctified by the Blackfeet and many other tribes because they recognized how important these animals were in creating these ecological oases. So, a lot of what I tried to do when I worked on this book was just, figure out what a fully beavered landscape would have looked like. What was North America like when it had, let's say 400 million beavers? And there are, so many wonderful trappers journals and railroad survey reports and explorers diaries that kind of attest to this incredible historic presence. There are explorers crossing the state of Indiana who can't find a dry place to camp for 100 miles because beavers have just kind of ponded everything up. It's hard to overstate the influence of this animal. Lewis and Clark talk about seeing beaver dams in every single tributary of the Missouri River as far as the eye could see, up to the base of the mountain. Lewis was a really good beaver naturalist, and there are observations like this in the Corps of Discovery journals every single day, during their journey. So that was in 1805, that Lewis and Clark saw beaver dams everywhere in the Missouri Basin. In 1843, just 38 years later, John James Audubon, of course, the naturalist and painter, traveled the exact same route looking for a beaver to paint. And he couldn't find a single beaver in the entire Missouri Basin where, just 4 decades earlier, they'd been ubiquitous. So what happened to beavers in just 38 years? What did they all turn into? Well, they turned into hats, right? I think we sometimes hear the phrase beaver hat and think of like a big fluffy Davy Crockett type thing, but in fact, beaver hats were sort of these elegant Victorian top hats that were all the rage back in Europe. And beavers, along with timber and cod, were really the most important economic resource that that European colonists found in the quote unquote New World. It's really hard to overstate the extent to which this rapacious demand for beaver hats shaped early American history. This is the city seal of New York City, which is where I grew up. You can see the Dutch guy and the native guy hanging out, the windmills, the flour barrels, and there are the two beavers, which is this is still the seal of New York today. Just an incredible testament to how important beavers were economically. This is a beaver coin minted by the Oregon Territory, which once covered the entirety of the Northwest, and the value of one beaver coin was fixed to the value of one beaver pelt. So the entire economy of a quarter of the country operated under the pelt standard for a very long time. Practically every historical event prior to the Civil War has some kind of beaver connection. The Revolutionary War, one of the British offenses that pissed off the colonists was denying them access to trapping grounds west of the Appalachians. The Louisiana Purchase was fueled in part by Jefferson's desire to secure new areas for beaver trapping. And of course, it was those beaver trappers and traders who spread smallpox and other diseases that ravaged many native tribes. So this, the story of the fur trade is really the story of early American history and all of its kind of grandiosity and tragedy and disaster. So the fur trade, kind of begins in New England and, spreads very rapidly south and west across the continent. By sort of the mid 1700s or so, beavers are functionally extinct, certainly in New England. And, by the mid 1800s, they're, functionally extinct in, essentially the entire lower 48. And, it's really hard to overstate the extent to which this kind of industrial fur trade changed American landscapes. The fur trade wasn't just this hugely significant historical event. It was also this profound ecological event, right? What happens when you kill 400 million beavers and, drain 200 million beaver ponds? Well, you lose all of that pond and wetland habitat, right? streams eroded and wetlands dried up, and it was, kind of a cataclysm. And I think one incredible testament to how significant an event this was is the fact that in the Long Island Sound, when all of those beaver dams broke down and all of those beaver ponds drained to the ocean, they carried so many nutrients that they actually fertilized this enormous plankton bloom, which then settled out. So today, if you take a sediment core in Long Island Sound, off the coast of Connecticut, you'll see this layer of diatoms that was fertilized by the flushing of all of these beaver ponds. I think that's just kind of an amazing testament to how powerful beavers were and what a significant event the loss of them was. In New England too, the loss of beavers was in some ways hugely beneficial to settlement, right? When you drain a beaver pond, what's left behind? Well, you have this, this flat, incredibly fertile, treeless, rockless footprint, of just perfect agricultural land, and lots of early settlers talk about how, valuable it was to kind of plant your crops, in the aftermath of beavers, especially in New England, such a kind of a rocky, infertile place. So beavers, in some ways made agriculture possible in the New World. But, for other species, obviously the loss of beavers would have been, again, a disaster. So when you've got a, kind of a healthy beaver-rich stream, all of those beaver dams are basically acting as speed bumps, right? They're slowing water down, they're spreading water out into the floodplain. And when you lose all those beaver dams, you lose all of those speed bumps, and there's nothing checking the velocity of water. And you get this really dramatic kind of catastrophic erosion where streams cut all the way down to the, down to bedrock. And, I think that we often look at a degraded, eroded, incised stream like this and say, well, that's, probably the result of overgrazing or logging or mining or some other historic impact. But, in so many cases, this is the result of beaver trapping. So, again, I think that, we don't think about the fur trade in the same terms as we think about those other historic ecological impacts. But, again, the fur trade was really one of the first ways in which, white people modified North America. And obviously, again, I keep saying this, but would have been a cataclysm for so many species. This is the coho salmon, a species that lives on the Pacific coast. Although certainly the same would have been true for Atlantic salmon in New England. And there have been studies showing that the loss of beaver ponds was sort of led to this 97% loss in juvenile rearing habitat for coho salmon. So again, this kind of aquatic dust bowl that resulted from beaver trapping. So, by 1900 or so, the beaver population has kind of reached its nadir. We've gone from 400 million beavers or several hundred million beavers to about 100,000 beavers left in North America, nearly all of them in Canada. It's almost impossible to find a beaver in the lower 48. But, fortunately, various state biologists start to wise up around this time to say, hey, wait a second, these animals are more valuable alive than dead. They begin to reintroduce beavers. Using stock from Canada primarily, where some beavers still survive. Yellowstone National Park supplied a bunch of beavers to various states in New England, and slowly, beaver populations start to recover. Probably the most famous beaver reintroduction was in Idaho in the 1940s. You guys might have seen this footage, but Idaho wanted to reintroduce beavers into what is today the Frank Church Wilderness area. First, they tried moving the beavers on horseback. Neither the beavers nor the horses really took kindly to that. So then, one of these biologists had the bright idea of actually stuffing them into crates and throwing them out of airplanes, and basically, sending these little furry paratroopers into the backcountry. So in 1948, Idaho airdropped 76 beavers. 75 of the beavers survived. One beaver, unfortunately, escaped from the crate and fell to his death. Very sad. But the next year, when they flew back over this landscape, they saw beaver ponds and wetlands and all the places where they dropped these animals. So, that was a very successful project. Nobody's airdropping beavers today, but that was how it was done in the 1940s. So, all through the 20th century, you've got beaver populations recovering, right? They're being reintroduced. There have been trapping restrictions put into place. The beavers are bouncing back. And as they do, they begin to recolonize a lot of the areas that we colonized in their absence, right? It turns out that good beaver habitat and good human habitat is basically one and the same. We both like these low gradient stream corridors and nice fertile floodplains. That's where they build their dams, and that's where we put our roads and railroads and power lines and other infrastructure, right? Now, I'd argue that we're kind of the nuisance species more than they are, but there's no question that they can be difficult animals to coexist with, right? Here's a set of railroad tracks in Massachusetts that I visited a few years ago. These tracks had just been refurbished, this big multi-million-dollar project, and like 3 months later, beavers had them underwater, so they're that's the sort of thing that beavers do. Here's a cabin in New Mexico that I came upon, flooded by beavers. I like this picture because what you can sort of see is that the beavers begin their dam in the top left corner of the screen. They dam up to the base of the cabin, then they incorporate the cabin in their dam, and then they keep going on the right side of the screen, right? So, you wouldn't want to be that landowner, but you have to admire the ingenuity of the animals in that instance. Probably the most common cause of beaver conflict is damming and road culverts, right? For a beaver, the roadbed is like the world's greatest dam, and the culvert, the pipe the stream runs through, is the leak in the dam, and beavers plug leaks, right? That's what they do. So the water level rises, the road washes out. This very expensive and time-consuming and dangerous thing to fix. That's probably the most common cause of beaver conflicts in the United States. But they do get into kind of weirder trouble sometimes. A few years ago, a beaver broke into a dollar store in Maryland and was actually apprehended while browsing the plastic Christmas tree rack, which feels like a metaphor for something. They get into all kinds of weird mischief. And the way that these beaver conflicts are almost universally handled is by killing the offending beaver, right? Which makes a lot of sense. The beaver's causing a problem, get the beaver out of there. But there are some issues with that kind of reflexive, lethal approach to beaver management. I mean, the first, of course, is that when you eliminate those beavers, you're also eliminating the potential for this great pond and wetland habitat that we care about so much. But also, all you're doing is putting up a vacancy sign for the next family of beavers, right? As long as that culvert is still there, beckoning to them, they're always going to come back. So there are communities around the country, certainly including Maine, that are engaged in this very expensive and, I'd argue inhumane and certainly ecologically nonsensical cycle of trapping and recolonization and trapping and recolonization. Every year, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the federal government, kills between 20,000 and 25,000 beavers. Often in public roads conflicts or on private property, and certainly private nuisance trappers are killing many tens and possibly hundreds of thousands more. We have no idea how many beavers are being killed, but certainly it's this kind of ongoing conflict, and you start to wonder. Maybe there are better ways of doing business, of solving these problems. So lots of beavers get killed for cutting down trees, cutting down people's fruit trees or their ornamental trees or whatever. And I just don't think that any beaver should ever be killed for cutting down a tree. That's just too easy a problem to solve with a bit of, kind of heavy duty wire fencing. And this is kind of a cool case study. This is in the town that I live in Colorado, where, the local land trust had this property, and there were these, beautiful old cottonwood trees that they wanted to protect from the beavers. Okay, that's fine. So they fenced off those cottonwoods, and they left unfenced the non-native Siberian elm trees, which the beavers took down. So that's invasive vegetation management using beavers as your agent. I think that's a pretty cool example of what you can accomplish, when you sort of think about creatively partnering with these animals instead of killing them. When the problem is flooding, that's a kind of a harder problem to solve. But there too, we've got options. This guy is Skip Lyle, who some of you probably know. Skip is based in Vermont, but he really cut his teeth in Maine as a biologist with the Penobscot Nation. And Skip is the inventor of the Beaver Deceiver, which is basically this pipe and fence system that you kind of run the pipe into the road culvert or through the beaver dam, and you're basically moving you're moving water from the upstream side to the downstream side, right? You're taking that pond that's, you know, flooding your road or your backyard or what have you, and you're just, you know, creating a leak in the dam essentially with the pipe, and you're just dropping that water level to a point that both humans and rodents can tolerate, you know, and the cages are there to stop the beavers from plugging up those pipe ends, because, you know, they certainly will do that. And, you know, there's a big body of literature, you know, showing that Skip's devices are incredibly effective and cost effective as well. Here's, you know, kind of a very low key or very low tech version that, you know, some colleagues and I put in my former home up in Spokane, Washington. If Skip saw this picture, he would kill me for building such a crappy version of, you know, his brilliant technology. But, you know, here you can see, you know, in the hour or so since this pipe was installed, you know, you can see on the trunks of these trees that the water level has dropped, you know, let's say 6 to 10 inches already. And, you know, a couple of years later, you know, that. So, I mean, this is basically a call in response to a landowner, you know, who couldn't access much of her property because beavers were flooding it. So, you know, you put the pipe in, drop that pond level, let the flood waters recede a little bit. You know, you're still maintaining enough water in that pond that the beavers feel safe. And, you know, a few years down the line, you know, beavers and humans are kind of coexisting nicely there. So this is, you know, again, a pretty low tech version of the really awesome devices that Skip builds. But, you know, the same kind of principle. You're just moving water from one side to the other. And again, you know, like I said, a big body of literature showing that these things work really well. You know, they're something like 87 to 97% effective. Again, also very cost effective. You know, for every dollar you spend on a beaver deceiver, you return $8 or so in avoided trapping and road maintenance costs. So, you know, clearly there are many, many thousands of conflict points all over the country that we're currently managing beavers lethally, where we could be using more creative, humane, cost-effective solutions instead, non-lethal approaches. Another option that's you know, at our disposal, and I actually don't really know the Maine's regulations around beaver relocation, but, you know, certainly is something that we do a lot in Colorado and other Western states, is live trapping and relocating beavers, right? Catching them in places we don't want them and putting them in places we do, which typically means moving beavers from private land to public land. This is a Hancock trap, kind of a standard beaver live trap. And here's Sandy and Chomper heading off to their new home. This is up in kind of the Methow Valley in north central Washington state, near the towns of Winthrop and Twisp, a couple hours east of Seattle, where, you know, lots of beaver relocation happens. Again, you know, you're typically trying to capture and move an entire beaver colony or family together. You know, they're very family-oriented animals, right? You don't want to break up the families. You know, if you catch a kind of a beaver by itself, you know, lots of beaver management projects will actually try to play matchmaker and, you know, pair up males and females in, you know, in fish hatcheries or other facilities built for the purpose. And again, you know, it's just kind of a great way of essentially repopulating streams and drainages that historically had beavers and don't have them any longer. Another kind of cool beaver management technique that you know, is increasingly popular is beaver mimicry, right? Building beaver dam analogs, these sort of human-built beaver-like structures. And you know, one of the reasons that these beaver dam analogs are so useful is that, you know, in a lot of cases, when you have a really degraded or eroded stream, you know, that's a place that you would want beavers to live, but beavers themselves wouldn't want to settle there, right? They don't want to live in a, you know, a super eroded stream where the flow is like a fire hose. So in that case, you know, it can make sense to kind of give them a leg up, you know, pound some of these posts into the stream bed, weave some, you know, some straw or willows in there to kind of impound some water, and basically create a little beaver starter kit, essentially a small pond, a kind of a low-tech dam that the genuine animals can kind of maintain themselves and improve over time. So this is, you know, increasingly a popular strategy, you know, everywhere from California to Maryland, where it's, you know, being used to kind of encourage beaver recolonization in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. You know, a super cheap and you know, low-tech stream restoration technique. Obviously, broken fingers can be a hazard, but you know, there are thousands of these beaver dam analogs being built all over the country now to kind of encourage recolonization of beavers. And you know, the place where this technique was really pioneered was in Oregon, in a stream called Bridge Creek. which was, historically this great beaver-rich stream, and then was, sort of degraded over time by cattle grazing and beaver trapping, so there were some beavers in the stream, but not a ton. And so scientists built 115 of these beaver dam analogs. The beavers, went gangbusters, built 120 of their own dams. The inundated area, so the amount of land underwater more than doubled, right, as beavers, are spreading water out into the floodplain. They also filled up all of these old side channels, right? So, so historically the stream was this, kind of great big mess of spaghetti-like strands going everywhere. And then, when it lost its beavers, it simplified into a single threaded channel. And by spreading water in the floodplain, you're just rehydrating all of those old channels and, dramatically increasing the amount of habitat for other species. So here, scientists saw a 50% survival increase in juvenile steelhead, which are basically sea-run rainbow trout. So that's a threatened species, whose survival has dramatically increased thanks to this kind of cool human-beaver partnership. So again, another neat example of what can happen when you view these animals as allies rather than adversaries. So, I've been talking about beavers creating habitat for fish and moose and, amphibians and other species, but what do they do for us humans? Why would we, as a kind of a selfish, self-interested species, care about their restoration? And, there are a few really wonderful things that beavers do. They're fantastic stream restorers and water capturers, right? This is kind of a classic example of kind of a case study that we in the beaver community always talk about. But this is a stream in northeast Nevada in Elko County. This is what it looked like in 1980 after a century of overgrazing and beaver trapping, and so that's what it looked like 40 years ago, and here's what it looks like today. Thanks in large part to the kind of the natural recovery of beavers. When it looked like this back in the 80s and 90s, the federal government and the ranchers sort of put in a bunch of very common sense grazing restrictions to allow the riparian vegetation to recover. The beavers weren't reintroduced, they just kind of found their way back into this system. They have this kind of magical way of, finding the good available habitat, and just, dramatically overhauled this, this whole river system. This is actually cattail growth atop an old beaver dam. So they're really deeply embedded into this ecosystem at this point. Researchers who studied this particular stream found that beavers had added 20 acres of open water, right? So they're building dams, creating ponds, spreading water out, doing the stuff that beavers do. They added 3 miles to the wetted stream length. So what does that mean? Well, back when the stream looked like this, the stream was so degraded that it was basically going dry before reaching its confluence with the main stem river, right? By building dams and storing water, beavers slowed the water down enough so that there was still water in the stream come August, September, the really hot, dry season. So beavers took a seasonal stream and made it perennial. I think that's a pretty incredible thing to contemplate. They also added 2 feet to the water table. What does that mean? Well, when you've got a beaver pond, there's all of the visible surface water you can see, but what you don't see is the weight of that pond forcing water into the ground, all of the water out on the floodplain kind of soaking into that floodplain sponge and recharging aquifers, hydrating soils, raising water tables. So beavers are storing, 5 to 10 times more groundwater than surface water. And, you generally don't see that, but it's, hugely significant. So in effect, they're sub-irrigators, right? They're spreading water out and they're raising the water table, recharging the soil. And that's a really big deal for guys like this. This is James Rogers, who's a rancher in Nevada, who's really embraced beavers because, as he pointed out to me, beavers are basically increasing forage production on his grazing allotment, his ranch, tenfold, which means more weight on his cattle and more money in his back pocket, right? So now in Nevada, there's this great, very progressive cluster of pro-beaver ranchers who have seen how valuable these animals are from a water storage and stream restoration and irrigation standpoint. The other really wonderful beaver benefit that certainly is important in New England is that they're great at slowing down floods, right? They really prevent floods, which is sort of counterintuitive. I think we think about beavers as causing floods, not stopping them. But when you get, a big pulse of stormwater, racing down a stream, well, it hits those beaver dams. It's captured in the pond. It spreads out laterally onto the floodplain. It sinks into the ground. And there have been studies showing that a single family of beavers can capture 30% of the stormwater, the flood water, after a big rain event. So this is actually a beaver complex in Scotland, where Eurasian beavers, a kind of a close cousin to our North American beavers, have been reintroduced largely for their flood control benefit. So I think that's again another pretty magical thing to think about, right? Is that we've got these two polar opposite problems on the hydrograph. Drought on one end, flooding on the other end, both being exacerbated by climate change. And yet beavers can help us manage both of them by kind of stabilizing that hydrograph and slowing down flows and just spreading water out. So again, drought, flooding, beavers help us tackle them both. I think that's pretty incredible. Another fabulous thing that beavers do, right? They're great at capturing pollution. You get the streams coming along, it's carrying nitrates and phosphorus and heavy metals from mining and pesticides and herbicides, all of this stuff. And then it hits that beaver dam and it has a chance to settle out. The stream loses its energy and it just drops all of those suspended solids, which get, entrained in the bottom of the pond and kind of buried by many successive layers of sediment. And the nitrates have a chance to kind of denitrify and turn into gas and be released. So beavers, they're really wonderful at capturing pollution. Again, a big part of why they're being restored now in places like the Chesapeake Bay and the Long Island Sound, these very kind of nitrified ecosystems. Beavers, in addition to capturing all this pollution, they're also sequestering lots of carbon, right? There's all of this organic matter that's being carried along in the stream. And when that stuff settles out, that's stored in the pond as effectively as it would be, in an old growth forest. You can see this kind of beautiful layer cake of, organic carbon rich sediment that beavers have kind of captured over time. So just as you might, plant trees to capture carbon, you could also plant pilebeavers. And then, the final benefit, and one that, is probably more relevant to us here in Colorado than to you in Maine, but, is certainly driving beaver restoration all over the country, is they're great firefighters, right? Obviously, water doesn't burn. And by spreading water out and, hydrating those plants, turning all of those dry, brown, crispy, drought affected plants into lush, green, wet, moist plants, beavers really prevent the spread of wildfire. And, here's kind of a beautiful example of this. This is in Idaho. You can see that all of the kind of the upland areas have just been burnt to a crisp. And the only intact, unaffected part of the landscape is that, that beaver mediated valley bottom. So, in fact, there are some researchers who have proposed that the U.S. Forest Service change its mascot from Smoky Bear to Smoky Beaver because beavers are such effective firefighters. So, given all of these wonderful beaver benefits, all of the fantastic things they do for us and other species, why do we still kill so many of them? Why is our relationship with beavers still so antagonistic? And I think that a lot of it is that when we eliminated hundreds of millions of beavers from North America, we changed the landscape in ways that we don't fully understand. And I think that we internalized the concept of a healthy, natural, normal stream being this, kind of single thread, cobble-bottomed, free-flowing, fast-moving system, like you'd see in, an Orvis catalog or a Field and Stream magazine or something like that. When in reality, so many of our aquatic ecosystems looked like this instead. They were sort of the water was, barely flowing. There are kind of dead and dying trees everywhere. It all smells like decomposition. If you put your foot in there, it'd be this mucky bottom that would steal your boots. I think this is not the kind of system that we view as being quote unquote normal. But, in so many places, this was more rule than exception, these kinds of pond and wetland systems. I think that now, whenever beavers recolonize an ecosystem, we view it as fundamentally unnatural, right? Beavers are wreaking havoc. They're cutting down trees. They're, impounding these beautiful free-flowing streams. But again, I think that's largely because we have incredibly short historical memories, right? We don't we don't know or don't recall what these systems used to look like. So if we're going to fully restore beavers, we have to also reconfigure our own ecological imaginations in a sense, and think differently about the kinds of systems that we consider healthy and natural. So to sum it all up, we have this fantastic animal. It provides all of these wonderful services for us and other species. It does it all for free, and best of all, it doesn't need permits. That's another really nice beaver benefit. So as the mantra of the Beaver Believer goes, let's get out of the way and let the rodent do the work. That's the that's what all we Beaver Believers tell ourselves. So with that, I'll say thank you so much for inviting me and for spending this time with me. We've got some time for questions, I think. I did write a book about this stuff. If today merely whetted your appetite for beaver content. So again, thank you all so much, and we'll take some questions, I guess.
That was fabulous, Ben, and I can't believe you got that all out in a short time. So thank you. And someone of the comments right on the chat were just how mind-blowing some of that is. It's amazing. But we do have some great questions here, and people can keep putting them in if they need to. One question from Marcia is, how high must a fence be around a tree to protect the tree?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess like sort of eyeballing it, I think that 4 feet would probably do it. I will say that there's a great nonprofit called the Beaver Institute. I'll just put their URL in the chat. And they've got it's just beaverinstitute.org. They're based in Massachusetts, and they have just all kinds of wonderful resources for sort of DIY beaver mitigation projects. So that they've got a whole page about sort of fencing, from what gauge of wire to use, to how high the fence should be, to how deep it should be buried in the soil. So check out Beaver Institute for any really sort of like practical, how do I protect my property from beavers questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I guess it probably would also depend a little bit on how much snow you're liable to get, right, Ben? And if your pond freezes or your waterway freezes and that sort of thing. Yeah,
definitely. There's some really cool. I've definitely seen some cool spots where a beaver will chew. You'll come by in the summer and there'll be beaver chew like 8 foot up a tree, and you're like, wow, how did was this like a giant Pleistocene beaver? What happened here? But of course, it was a beaver standing on snowpack. So yeah, that could affect things too.
Yeah. Catherine asked, how do beavers and muskrats relate or coexist?
Yeah, they coexist beautifully. Muskrats will actually live in beaver lodges, and the beavers tolerate them. I don't really know why the beavers tolerate them, but they do. And you'll often see muskrats actually diving before a beaver lodge to kind of go up into it. So yeah, they do really well. Beavers create fantastic muskrat habitat.
Neat. Martha asks, did you use a fence to protect the pond end of your small beaver deceiver, or were these pipes too small for the beavers to bother plugging?
No, they did. Yeah, it was interesting. They did. So in that case, we did not have a fence on that one. We probably should have. Again, if Skip Lyle saw that picture, he'd smack me upside the head, I think. But so in that case, the that landowner just kind of went out every day for a few weeks and just pulled any material the beavers had wadded up in there, and according to her, they eventually got the message and stopped trying. I don't know, that's probably not typical. You do want a fence end over that outflow for sure. I mean, that we were sort of constrained by funding and other issues, but in general, you do want to protect those pipe ends.
Yeah, and I'll just tell folks that we actually are going to have Skip in the area, I think in the spring, doing a number of programs, putting in some beaver deceivers for our towns of Bristol, South Bristol, Damariscotta, Newcastle. We haven't determined exactly where, but over the next 2 years, actually, we're going to help Coastal Rivers is going to fund a couple of projects, one in each town probably, with Skip putting in beaver deceivers. And so we're going to have a opportunity for the public to come and see those, or after the fact, if you want to see what they look like, there'll be an opportunity to hopefully see that in process. So if people want to learn more about beaver deceivers, I think there'll be opportunities in the region to do that in the near future. So that's encouraging. There's a question about your writing process, Ben. What is it like? Are you writing in while you're on the road researching, or do you wait until you gather all your information before you sit down to work?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's a combination of both. I mean, certainly, so, working on this book, I mean, I basically, I essentially did like a 3-month long beaver road trip where I like sublet my apartment, and my wife was working remotely, and just drove around the country for 3 months, living out of my car and sleeping on the ground, and just visiting anybody who would talk to me about beavers. And I was certainly making copious notes every day, and writing when I could. But then that fall, I just sort of hunkered down and wrote all that stuff up. And actually, I got a great writing residency at Aldo Leopold's former house in New Mexico, which was just an incredibly wonderful, inspiring place to spend 6 weeks or so. And that was where I wrote a lot of it.
Neat. That's a great story all by itself right there. Charlie says, we put in a beaver deceiver because of a flooded ranch road and it works perfectly. That's a comment from Charlie. And Chris has a comment and a question. It looks like Chris writes, in Maine, we cannot keep beavers and other fur bearers safe from trapping on any preserved lands that use public funds, in part because it is traditional use and also an income source. But modern prices have plummeted to a mere 10 to 25 cents. So is there an argument now is the argument outdated now, and can or should we change Maine law?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I can't really attest to the Maine law aspect of that. But certainly you're right that pelt prices are very low. I mean, last I saw at the North American Fur Auction, it was like $11 per beaver pelt. So yeah, nobody is making a living beaver trapping, right? Anybody who's trapping is trapping recreationally, for the same reason that I go fly fishing, because they enjoy it. It's not an economic activity. I mean, certainly, I think that many more beavers get killed for being quote unquote nuisances than they do, by recreational trappers. But yeah, that's, I mean, certainly, changing trapping regulations is a great way to, go about increasing beaver populations. I mean, we certainly saw that in Massachusetts, where most types of lethal traps were banned by ballot initiative in the late 1990s. And the beaver population something like tripled, in the years after that. So I'm not, yeah, it's I'm not sure that recreational trapping on public lands is the primary thing that's holding beaver populations back, but it certainly is a factor. And other states like Washington have also done a lot to kind of restrict trapping. So that's certainly something that other states have done, and could be a possibility in Maine.
Lucy had a fun comment. She says, bumper stickers shall be issued, plant beavers.
I like it. I have one that says release the beavers, which I also like.
James says or asks, how were beavers reintroduced in Maine?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it's a combination of two things. I could be missing something, but certainly many came down naturally from Canada at one point. There was some natural recolonization in New England, but a lot of them actually came from. So in 1906, beavers. So in New York State, there was a single colony of beavers left in the entire state of New York in the Adirondacks. So in 1906, there was this big centennial Lewis and Clark celebration happening in St. Louis. And the Canadian delegation at the Lewis and Clark Centennial brought down a bunch of live beavers. So the state of New York sent down a couple of wildlife biologists who bought those beavers off of the Canadian delegation at the Lewis and Clark Centennial, brought them back to the Adirondacks and released them. And those beavers then became the kind of the seed for virtually all of the beavers in New England. They just kind of beavers are just incredibly good at increasing their populations rapidly, right? They're rodents, so that, they're pretty prolific breeders, and they engineer their own habitat, right? So, from a couple of dozen Canadian beavers in 1906, by the 1920s, there were something like 20,000 beavers in New England that were all descended from those New York that New York reintroduction. So I'm sure that Maine has many beavers that came from that New York reintroduced population in 1906.
Interesting. So Lynn asks, are landowners required to obtain any permits or other permissions before putting in a beaver deceiver?
In Maine, I have no idea. That's a great question for Skip. I don't know,
It's a
Sarah.
great question, Lynn.
Do you know the answer to that, Sarah? Or maybe who's it? Was it Charlie who installed the beaver deceiver? Maybe he could pipe it.
Yeah, that might not have been in Maine. I'm not sure.
Thank you. That was in New Mexico. That's outside of Las Vegas, New Mexico.
Got it. Yeah, I don't. Yeah. I mean, every state has a different process around those kinds of hydrological modifications, and yeah, check with your state engineer.
Yeah, great question. I don't know the answer to it. Thank you, Lynn. Let's see. A few more questions. Why do I see half-felled large oaks? Do the beavers give up? Do they eat the cambium layer just around the cut trunk ring? Question mark.
Yeah, that's a great question. Beavers do all kinds of weird things. It does, I mean, certainly you will see them girdle trees where they'll just eat all of the cambium they can access, without actually felling the tree. Certainly you see that on larger trees. I mean, it does seem like they will begin to cut a tree or to fell a tree, and then get bored or move on, or maybe a predator scares them off or something. I mean, it is really, really weird. You do see a lot of cuts that seem illogical to our human eyes, and must make sense only to the beaver. So I don't know the answer. They are good. One thing I'll say is that they're good. There have been a couple studies showing that they're really good directional fellers. That they do fell trees toward their pond much more often than not. So there's definitely a method to their madness, but sometimes it does seem like madness.
Great. So Jackie just comments, Park Service at the C&O Canal in Washington, D.C. are moving beavers who are damming up the canal, taking down huge trees. That's just a sharing comment. It's interesting. James says, how do you happen to know what the state considers the cultural capacity of beavers in Maine?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe somebody does. I mean, certainly, I think that what James is alluding to is that there are kind of two types of capacity, right? There's the biological carrying capacity, which is, how many beavers or black bears or wolves or whatever, a landscape can support from a biological perspective. And then there's the cultural capacity, which James referenced, which is sort of how many beavers or wolves or what have you, the humans can support, right? And certainly the first number is a lot higher than the second number, but I think that's why beaver deceivers and other kind of non-lethal conflict mitigation techniques like as Skip has developed are so important, because they increase that cultural capacity, right? If you're able to solve every beaver problem, well, people tolerate more beavers on the landscape, right? So I think I don't know what the number is, but I do think it's really important that we get those those cultural carrying capacities up.
Carolyn asks, do beavers fell poplars just for the leaves?
No, they will eat the leaves, but they'll also, I think they're really felling for that cambium, that inner bark. That's really what they're eating, but they'll eat the leaves too, for sure.
And Susan asks, are you familiar with the book Beaver Sprite?
I am. Yeah, that's a for those who don't know, that's a fantastic book about a woman named Dorothy Richards, who basically created a beaver sanctuary in her home in New York, and beavers lived in her house, and occasionally gnawed her furniture. And if you just Google Dorothy Richards Beaver Sprite, there's just this incredible wealth of just unbelievable photos of beavers hanging out in her dining room. So that's a wonderful book, and certainly I'm very proud to be part of a very long lineage of beaver advocates and believers, and Dorothy is definitely one of our heroes for sure in the beaver community.
All right, let's see. Hannah asks, Are there any suggestions out there on how to respond to the naysayers who believe the beavers are tainting their streams with Giardia?
Yeah, the fact that Giardia ended up, being called beaver fever was like the worst possible thing for beavers. Because it could have been called muskrat fever, or really like domestic pet and livestock fever, right? I mean, that's, yes, beavers do carry and sometimes amplify Giardia in water bodies, but so do dogs and cats and cows and and other aquatic mammals, and birds will bring it in on their feet and talons. So, that's how I respond to that question typically is, yes, okay, beavers, beavers do carry and amplify Giardia, but, you are much more likely to get Giardia from a domestic animal than from a wild one.
Great, that's helpful. Thank you. Beavers dammed up a wooded stream and occupied the area for 5 or 6 years and then moved on. Do you have an idea why that might happen? And can they run out of food in more forested areas? That's a question from Carolyn.
Yeah, it's a great question. Beavers move on for all kinds of reasons, again, that are, probably fathomable only to the beavers. They don't tend to run out of food. I think that the notion that they eat themselves out of house and home is generally a myth. Certainly, it's a myth in New England, where there's plenty of deciduous material. Maybe it happens out west in somewhere like Nevada sometimes. A few possible explanations. They could have been predated, right? Maybe a black bear got them. They also they're really susceptible to disease die-offs as well. They carry tularemia, which is that's kind of the main disease that affects beavers, and because they live in very close quarters in the lodge, and they're aquatic animals, right? So the disease is transmitted readily through water. I think a lot of the time when beavers mysteriously leave an area, it's due to some kind of disease dynamic, which we don't really recognize. So there are lots of possible explanations.
Lucy shares that she recently saw an area where beavers were working on a stand of alders, and in several cases they had chomped down all but one trunk, and this seemed a sustainable practice to her, she observed.
That's cool. Yeah, they're almost like rotational farmers, right? They, by spreading water out, they're essentially irrigating their own food supply, and you will see them. They'll work on the north side of the pond one year, sort of exhaust that area, but meanwhile, their irrigation is cultivating that willow or aspen food source on the south side of the pond. They just kind of bounce around the pond, hitting different stands even as they grow new stands. So they are kind of an amazing sustainable rotational grazer.
Nancy says, my granddaughter wants to leave food treats for beavers on a pond in their land. What do you think of that? And carrots or apples? ?
Yeah, they love apples. Carrots they'll eat, but apples they seem pretty crazy about. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not totally opposed to that. I think that it's not like a black bear, which you're going to lure into close contact with humans by putting out your unprotected garbage or your bird feeder or something, right? It's not like the beaver is going to leave the pond and and raid your back porch or something. So I definitely do see people leaving food for beavers, and I don't get too mad at them.
Jackie says, how do they benefit a lake? They don't increase the lake size, do they? ? Or are they just living?
Yeah, sometimes you will see them dam a lake outflow, and they can raise the level of even a pretty large lake. But I think in general, as Jackie says, they're just living. They have a bank lodge. One thing I will say about that is that certainly those, even the beaver lodge, right, not just the dam, can be really good habitat. Because they're typically sort of these protruding woody overhangs that, that guard those underwater tunnel entrances. And, very often you see, fish or tadpoles, living in that kind of woody structure around the base of the lodge. And, in fact, I used to live in Northampton, Massachusetts, and, there people would actually stand up on top of a big lakeshore beaver lodge and actually fish for bass off the top of the lodge, and catch some pretty big bass that had kind of congregated around that lodge. And in fact, the beavers were so habituated to fishermen that they would come out and maintain the lodge even as people fished off of it, which is pretty amazing to see. So even those lodges can be pretty good habitat.
Neat. A number of folks are just saying thank you and that your book is great and this has been super interesting. So thank you for all that, Ben, and thanks for those who have written nice notes in the chat. It's really fabulous. Jackie says, I'm sorry, I already read that one. Tony mentions just another recently released pro beaver book called Beaverland by Lila Phillip. So I haven't come across that, but thanks for mentioning that. That's great. Good. Well, lots of kind comments. I'll share them with you later, Ben, through the email. Thank you, everyone. And thank you all who tried as many times as you needed to get on. I know that getting on initially was a frustrating procedure for a few folks. So I'm sorry for the passcode being confusing to folks or not being where it needed to be. So I apologize for that, but glad everyone has made it. We did have, 105 participants today. So looks like most everyone got here and that's wonderful. Look forward to seeing you all out on trails around us and generally enjoying wildlife and nature. So thank you. And Ben, thank you so much. This was just amazingly informative and just what we needed.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Thanks to you all, and hi, Kelsey and Matt. Good to see you guys. And yeah, thanks a lot.
All right. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you again. I'll send all your kind comments to Ben.
Okay.
Have a great night.